Welcome to Guest and Gusto, SCAD's virtual series of conversations and digital content with the creators and innovators remaking culture. I'm Imfan Akpan, Professor of Liberal Arts at SCAD, and I'm happy to introduce Neil Howe. Neil is the Managing Director of Demography at Hedgeye Risk Management, an independent financial research firm, an acclaimed best-selling author and speaker. He is a renowned authority on social change in America and is the nation's leading thinker on today's generations, who they are, what motivates them, and how they will shape America's future. A historian, economist, and demographer, Neil is also a recognized authority on global aging, long-term fiscal policy, and migration. He is currently a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Global Aging Institute, both in Washington, D.C. Wow. Before I turn it over to Neil, we need to take a moment and answer our poll question to ensure a great conversation. Today, you have a chance to win a Jenna Williams pottery piece for participating. So the question is, what challenge facing the next generation do you want Neil to discuss more? Entitlement, going to college, pandemic, protests? We will have the winning poll after Neil's lecture, as well as have a moment to ask him a few questions. So please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. And now, let's begin. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Just let me know if I'm on, and I will start. All right, I think we're good to go. So again, thank you, Savannah, Atlanta, wherever you are. You're probably all over the country actually right now. I fell in love with this institution when I was down there a few years ago. I remember the visit well, and I think generations topic, we talked with both faculty and students at the time, and I think it's more important now than ever. I'm going to be talking about generations and the rhythm of history, what's ahead for the millennial generation in college and after. And this is really an invitation to all of you. I don't care if you're faculty or students, to think long term. We're going to think outside the box. We're going to think in a macro scale, looking at the future that I hope will challenge you and make you look at both history and our future in a new way. And I'm going to start out with a very interesting question. I got various reactions when I talk to students about this, and that is, ask yourself this question: can you look ahead 20 years? Can you tell what America and the world will look and feel like around the year 2040? And it's amazing. I mean, I work with institutions all the time that have to do this. The Social Security Administration came to me not long ago and said, you know, we for our projections, we need to forecast immigration for the next 100 years. We have no idea how to do it. We couldn't. How in the world do we know? Basically, what we do is we select the most recent number and we just press repeat for 100 times, right? And you know, I'm a demographer, so I said, no, there are better ways you can do it, and we walk through it. But it's amazing. In our lives, both for education, our homes, our mortgages, founding families, whatever we're doing, we're implicitly making long-term decisions. And it's very challenging going back in history and thinking about how you would have known where America was going if you had been around at the time. I mean, think about this. Go back to the middle of the 1920s, kind of a sleepy era. We had, the Scopes trial in 1925. It was kind of we're kind of getting going under President Calvin Coolidge. And here's the United States Army, sort of a third-rate army in the world. We still believed in cavalry. Who could have predicted in the mid-1920s that America would look like this in the mid-1940s, that we would be a superpower colossus. We would have conquered half the world. Completely different relationship between government and the economy, between humanity and technology. How would you have predicted going from one to the next? Or here's another one. Here's America in the mid-1950s, and you see the standard chevron, a very standard and conventional, corny culture, right? I mean, just look at all these people. I mean, they're just conforming to their stereotypes, right? I mean, there they are, standard indeed, as well as in everything that's manifested in this shot. That's where our culture was. That's where America was. Who could have predicted 20 years into the future that America would look like this? A new generation, a completely different look to where our culture was going, and where you know, again, what America was and what America felt like. Or more recently, here's another one, and this is a little bit closer to home. This is for those of you who are students, is around probably not far from the time you were born. Francis Fukuyama, back in the middle 1990s, you know, talked about a world which was on the way toward individualism, markets, democracy, due process, globalism, and look where we ended up today, right? Here's another eminent author, Robert Kagan, not the end of history, the return of history. What do we see? This new emphasis on community, equality, populism, authority, rootedness. Where did this come from? How do we predict these changes? And that's what I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and I'm going to talk about it through the lens of generational change. There's a constant throughout history. History shapes generations in their youth, and then after about 40 years or so, generations of midlife leaders and parents, they shape history. This is a connected circle, and it's been going on for a long time. And it generates certain patterns that are very interesting. I'm going to come back to these patterns later, but first I want to just introduce the collective personae in our drama, and that is different social generations. These are groups that have a certain very familiar location in history. These are American social generations, and each of them are born over about 20 years or so, and these are very familiar names, and you might be even more familiar if you actually looked at it in terms of their location in history, right? So each of these generations, the GI generation, that was the group, we all know who they are. They came of age during the New Deal, the Great Depression, World War II. This is you know, the so-called greatest generation. We all know who they are. The silent generation, probably the most talked about member of whom right now is Joe Biden. They may finally get a member into the White House. And they were the children of Great Depression, World War II, and they came of age into young adulthood during the American High. You know, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy. Boomers, you can see how this works. Boomers have no memory of World War II. They were the kids in the American High, and they gave us the consciousness revolution, this enormous change in sort of social, cultural values, changing the way we thought about everything. Generation X, it's the children of the consciousness revolution. These are little kids getting mud splattered on them at Woodstock, right? And they came of age more recently, late 80s, 90s, early 00s, kind of the period of the culture wars, the 90s boom. And then you have millennials. They were the children of that era. You can see how this works, right? And they've been coming of age with this double whammy, the financial crisis, the war on terror, the 2020 pandemic, and what's next, right? I think a lot of us feel right now that history is speeding up, and we're going to come back to that because I think history, public history that is speeding up. And then you have, of course, the generation coming along after them. But what I want to do now very quickly is take you through some of these historical generations, say a few things about how, when they came of age, shaped how they saw life. And I'm going to talk a bit about millennials, and then we're going to conclude and we're going to talk about what this says about patterns of history. So join me on this ride. We're going to talk first about the GI generation. This an interesting name, isn't it? GI. It literally means government issue or general issue. It was stenciled on their backpacks when they went off to World War II. And I think when everyone thinks of this generation, we think about the greatest generation. That was a name given to them by Tom Brokaw in his book on them. Great for the fact that they saved the world from fascism. They created this cornucopia of prosperity after World War II, and they poured more concrete than any other generation in American history. They created all the public infrastructure, the harbors, the bridges, and the dams that we still use, right? We didn't build any more after they were gone. We're still dependent on that. But that's why we think of them as great. We all live in the civic shadow of this generation because this generation came together at a critical time in American history to get big things done. But I think one thing that's often overlooked is, well, okay, we all know what they did as a generation. We all know sort of, you know, the world they shaped and how they shaped the world. But what shaped them, right? And I think all of you out there, educators, might think about that. Who shaped the GIs? Where did they come from? And it's a fascinating story because if you go back to the first couple of decades of the 20th century when they're kids, this generation of little kids was fussed over by protective parents and communities that wanted to raise kids as good as the previous generation, who later became known as the lost generation, were just terrible. I mean, everyone lamented them. They had high rates of violence and juvenile delinquency and drug abuse. You know, back in 1900, Coca-Cola had the real thing, right? There's a lot of stuff kids could do. Well, later became protected for the GI generation. Part of the progressive movement in America was protection of children in the Harrison Drug Act to keep them away from drugs. We had finally prohibition to keep them away from alcohol. We had child labor laws to keep them off the streets and out of dangerous jobs. We had protected playgrounds and we did all kinds of things protectively for these kids. And by the 1920s, they started changing America's image of young people. No longer sort of risk-taking individualists, but much more collective team players. And by the time the great crash of 1929 hit, this generation banded together and by incredible majorities, estimated 80–85% majorities, voted for the Democratic Party and the New Deal coalition with FDR in 1932 and 1936. This became the first generation of African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party, no longer for the Republican Party. And after that, they became the CCC dam builders and tree planters. They went on to become the most uniformed generation per capita in American history during World War II. And after their great exploits, they came home and they just couldn't stop building. I mean, this is the generation that built Levittown and the suburbs, the interstate highways, the miracle vaccines. They got into midlife. They created the Civil Rights Act, the Great Society. Well, ultimately, of course, they were the ones who presided over taking humanity to the moon. You know, just an incredibly Promethean generation. And that's how we remember them. Ultimately, they got into huge arguments with their boomer kids who were born after World War II. The two of them didn't get along. The boomers kept asking, what's the moral purpose of just building all these huge institutions? Well, the GIs thought it was a good idea. The boomers, they just thought it was some big monstrosity. But the GIs were proud of it. And by the time the GIs started retiring in the mid-1960s, they called themselves, and everyone started calling themselves, senior citizens for the first time. Remember, these were the junior citizens back in the 1930s in World War II. Now that they were elders, we called them senior citizens. No one called old people senior citizens before this generation hit old age. You know, they just called them old people. That was good enough. But no, not this group. And it's interesting when we look at them. Coming of age priority, rising community, progress, secular progress. You measure it with GDP and tonnage. Attitude toward the establishment, we invented it. You know, boomers complain about the establishment. They invented it. Social and economic trends, minority share shrinking because we closed the immigration window in the early 1920s. Middle class strengthening. This generation represented, by the time they started retiring in the late 60s, the most equal distribution of income and wealth in the 20th century in America. and retirement age falling because they saved and because we gave them all, enhanced Social Security benefits. So there we are. I think you guys have to say a great civic generation. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the silent generation. And they're a different group. Every generation is different. And the silent too, they surprised people when they started coming of age. Well, how did the silents start out? Well, remember, they were growing up when a crisis was going on. There was a depression going on. There was World War II going on. And the style of raising children, which is already becoming more protective for the GI generation, approached the point of suffocation. These were the little rascals. These were the Shirley Temples. These were well-behaved kids with a very tight envelope of protection around them. And when they started coming of age just after World War II, they surprised older people. Unlike the GI generation that wanted to, a lot of them joined the Communist Party. They wanted to do aggressive things with government, conquer a lot of the world. The silent generation said, no, we don't want to change the system. We want to work within the system. We want to just be dutiful helpers. Fortune magazine had a cover story in 1949 called The College Class of 49, and the subtitle was Taking No Chances. On job interviews, their first questions were about pension plans. Think about it. And during the McCarthy era, when everyone was, wondering, which GIs actually belonged to the Communist Party back in the early 30s, they didn't say anything. They wanted to stay quiet. They didn't want anything to go on their permanent record, which is one of the reasons they're called the silent generation, actually. And so this is a generation that we always think of as dutiful, fitting in, doing what you're told. And partly because of their age, location, and history, and partly because they've been very loyal to their families and their jobs, they've financially done extremely well, right? They truly enjoyed the post-war prosperity. And of course, during the 80s and 90s, they rode that enormous bull market in bonds and stocks, and they, the last cohort of this generation started retiring in 2007, just before everything crashed. So one interesting feature of this generation is seniors today tower over the income of young people today like never before in American history, right? So here you can see, here's this blue bar you see down here is the silent generation. You can just see the total transformation of old people from the early 80s to today. And that yellow trend there that's Gen X, not so promising. And look at those. Look at those orange bars. Yeah, that's millennials. That didn't look so good either. So you can see how that looks. What do we think about the silent coming of age priority? Maximum community security. Attitude to the establishment, they didn't build it, they inherited it, right? And they dutifully served it. You think about, kind of like a generation of kind of Mr. Rogers generation, low key, a little bit like Joe Biden. Social and economic trends, minority share small, not many people migrated here during the Great Depression. Middle class very strong, retirement age low. I will say, by the way, silent generation has the smallest immigrant share of any generation in American history because it's been rising ever since their generation. All right, let's move on. Boomers. Well, we all know their story, right? I think, I don't know, everyone's heard about boomers. It's interesting about boomers. The pop culture has always been focused on everything they've been doing since the time they were born. It's almost as though no phase of life means anything until boomers have experienced it and can tell other generations all about it, right? These were the feet-on-demand Dr. Spock babies just after World War II. They were indulged for the first time. These were the beaver cleavers of the 1950s. These are the anti-draft, anti-Vietnam protesters, Vietnam grunts, inner city rioters in the 1960s. These were the famous yuppies of the late 1970s, early 1980s. Severely individualistic codes are following their own values, following their own sense of perfection. And I will say, I don't want to talk too much about boomers. I think you're already familiar with this generation, but two things about them to remember, two master trends. One is their individualism. And I think boomers represented a huge turn from the trend from GI to silent, suddenly America rediscovered individualism. I mean, you see this in things like retirement. You know, we no longer have defined benefit retirement. We have defined contribution. You know, if you contribute, you get money back. If you don't, you don't. Everyone has their own choice, right? Boomers are much less concerned about distribution of income than the GI or the silent generation was. Bunch of individuals, you all go your own way. So they've been a generation of rule breakers on college campuses, and later a generation of deregulators and tax cutters. It's a generation today that largely votes for the Republican Party, strong libertarian streak. In some ways, it's been reinforced even a little bit more by Generation X after them. But that's one aspect of boomers. And I think the other aspect of boomers is their moralism, right? I mean, boomers are obsessed with right versus wrong and good versus bad. And that's part of their cultural obsession. Right? Boomers are obsessed with values, and it's very difficult to compromise over values. And that's why boomers have, I think, done more than any other generation to lead us into this period of just extreme political polarization. Boomers don't want to back down. And their biggest fear about younger generations is they will back down and not absolutely go through with living up for what they truly believe in, whatever that is. So what do we got? Well, one thing we all know about boomers is their stranglehold on the culture, right? Ever since they come along, boomers have owned the culture, and other generations have celebrated them for this. So here you have the evolution of modern music, right? It just never changes. And ultimately, the last boomer will die, will no longer be playing that list of 1,200 golden oldies. And I think Gen X will have a bonfire of celebration, perhaps. But that's one aspect of boomers. I think the other aspect of boomers, though, is the flip side is when it comes to civic cooperation, this generation really does not have much of a track record. And I will quote here, this is one of my favorite quotes. Bruce Gibney, by the way, is a Gen X tycoon in Silicon Valley. I think he's probably worth $1 billion. But he wrote, like many Xers, he has a chip on his shoulder when it comes to boomers. And he wrote a wonderful screed against boomers called Generation of Sociopaths. And I will quote here, what happens if society is run by people who are to a large extent antisocial? Those people are the baby boomers, that vast and strange generation born between 1940 and 1964. And the society they created does not work very well. Well, amen to that. Just take a look at the pandemic lockdown and look how good boomers are doing, civically organizing that one. All right. Coming of age priority, rising individualism, this search for meaning. Attitude toward the establishment, they famously rejected it. We don't need that. And this goes very deep in the boomer generation. Even Hillary Clinton, I thought, very prophetically said, speaking really for most boomer women. I remember she said this in 2016, she ran for president. She says, I belong to the first generation of women who are financially and economically alone. We have to depend on ourselves. Again, radical individualizing of America under the boomer watch. And it's, both helped and hurt all members of this generation because it's had a good side and a bad side. Social and economic trends, minority share growing. We started opening up the immigration window in the mid-60s, middle class weakening, much more spread out distribution of income and wealth, retirement age rising. Well, because they either didn't save or we no longer have safety nets for them. All right, Generation X. You got a few current members here, right? We got one president, just barely made Generation X, born in 1961. Doug Coupland, interestingly, was also born in 1961. He gave the name to this generation. Gen X is an interesting name, isn't it? And it's a identity hiding label. It's kind of a label that says we don't want to belong to a label. That's one of the first things you learn when you talk to Gen Xers. They don't want to be labeled. They don't want to even be considered a group. And this is a famous Time magazine cover story you see here. This is when we first got to know them. I believe this is 1989 or 1990. And look at them all. These aren't boomers, all dressed in colors, teaching the world to sing. These are people dressed in black. They're all looking in different directions. They all look like they're in a police holding cell, right? They don't look happy. There's a little bit of a kind of a giant traffic accident quality to the term Generation X. And one of the things about Xers, they don't like to be considered a group because everyone's considered that if they are a group, they're going nowhere, right? There's something tragic about this generation's future. So any Xer wants to consider themselves an exception to their own generation. And this is a generation whose individualism, I think, is their greatest strength. This is the free agent generation, very accustomed to taking risks. And if they fail, they know it's their duty as an individual to get up and just try again. No one had much expectations of them, so if they do well, they consider that to be a triumph. We also call this generation a generation wearing shades. Anytime boomers like to ask those probing moralistic questions, they can put on those Ray-Ban sunglasses. That way the Xer gets to keep his privacy, the boomer gets to look at himself. That makes everyone happy. We sometimes also call them the 13th generation. Because this is the 13th in a row since the first US generation of Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And maybe 13 too, because it conjures up some of the bad luck and ill timing of their life cycle. This is a generation that came along as kids in the early 1960s when kids were not welcome. Remember, boomers came along and everyone indulged them in the 40s and 50s. By the time Xers came along, people were tired of kids. They had too many kids. And suddenly the schools no longer seemed to work in the mid-60s. The divorce rate suddenly exploded and the fertility rate plummeted. No one wanted to have kids. So this is also a generation became known as the baby bust generation. Lowest fertility rate in American history until very recently was 1974. It's actually now been exceeded very recently with millennials mainly giving birth, largely, however, in millennials' case, because of the economy. So there you've got this generation, and interestingly, it knew who it was at a very early age. One thing I often talk about in looking at Gen Xers as little kids, what kind of movies were we watching? What was popular, right? Evil child movies. And I often point out that this had an incredible popularity, this genre of demonic images of children, exactly when Gen Xers were small children. I mean, if they weren't devouring older people, they were annoyances like in Kramer versus Kramer. They were just in the way. They were kids you just wanted to terminate. They were so spoiled, like in Willy Wonka movies. Or Tatum O'Neal in Paper Moon. They were just tough kids. You didn't want to hug these kids. And that was another aspect of the Gen X early childhood. Kids were left alone to raise themselves. And people thought at the time that was a good way to raise kids. Let them just look at everything. Let them see life for what it is and learn that that's what life's about, is taking care of yourself. And now you see a generation that's now in midlife, doesn't think much about community. They don't run for public office. They don't have what you'd say deep civic instincts. And I will say this statistically, Gen X has a far smaller share of the governors of the United States or House members or senators than any earlier generation in American history. They simply avoided civic life. And a lot of that is they just don't believe it. You know, they look through it, they're too cynical, they're wary of these big institutions. They think everything comes from following individual instincts. This is one of the very classic UCLA freshman poll surveys, and you can see what it shows here. The share of Americans who, the share of college freshmen who thought that the most important thing of life was to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. And you can see here back in the late 1960s, these were boomers, right? And they outnumbered being well off financially by 3 or 4 to 1. But look how that changed when we went from boomers to Generation Xers as college freshmen. Suddenly it was all bottom line, right? And boomers and Xers, by the way, are very aware of these differences between them. And as for the Xers, their attitude is just die, you yuppie scum, because you don't understand how life really works. So there you got it. Coming of age priority, maximum individualism, risk-taking, added toward the establishment. We didn't protest against it. We just got along without it because we know it wouldn't be there for us. Social and economic trends, minorities share a large, very large immigrant generation for X. Middle class weak. This is the most spread out generation in terms of income and wealth. And retirement age, well, who knows? A lot of Xers, don't like to look at that. That's troublesome. All right, let me now talk a little bit about millennials. This is, for a lot of you, you are late wave. I think many of you, if you're in your early 20s, you're late wave members of this generation. Here's some sample people. You see many of these people, Pete Buttigieg, born in 1982. Bill Strauss and I, we coined the term millennial generation back actually in 1991. And the reason we gave the name millennial was that these kids born in 1982 would be the college class of 2000. And indeed, they would probably redefine, we thought, just given where history is moving, they would be a very different kind of generation than the generation that came before it. And indeed, they have become a different kind of generation. I'm going to talk a little bit about their emerging peer personality, and you're going to see here and kind of some of the ways they're different. There's one thing that everyone understands about millennials, and that is they're special. And I don't mean that facetiously. I know people talk about entitlement, millennial, and everything. They were raised to be special. They were raised to have high positive collective esteem. And this started very early on. You can just run a Google Ngram. Kids are special. How often was that mentioned in magazines and books across America? Well, back when Xers were little kids, no one ever said that. But take a look at how that actually took off when you had your first millennial kids, right? So suddenly boomers rediscovering, even being born again over having their first kids, suddenly the fertility rate began to rebound. Anyway, a very different era. And of course, you see here in employer branding how it's changed. It's like a love bombing, corporations going after millennials. You never would have approached a Gen Xer with this kind of advertising. Gen Xers would have run the other way, right? Millennials love it. Oh yeah, well they love me. Why not? I'm kind of special. Why not? And what about this? Bring your parents to work. I see constantly whenever I go to a workplace, and all the millennials there, I ask, how many of you have brought your parents in to see where you work? They like this. No Gen Xer ever did that. No boomer probably even, wanted their parents to know where they were working. Anyway, this is all very different. And this is all a different orientation of this generation. And this actually has historic consequences, as we'll see. This generation has been sheltered, by the way. A little bit of a parallel, which I'm going to come back to, much as the GI generation was sheltered. We've only had about 3 or 4 moral panics over children in American history. And one of them we've just had over the last 20 years. And in favor of millennials, we've just seen vast number of things that have been done, after everyone is aghast that we left Xers alone and no one took care of them. So suddenly there's a massive correction for millennials, everything from, and just, Reagan laws, Amber Alerts, Code Adams, some little kids lost in a Walmart, every door is locked. Generation has a very different sense. And they get it, right? I'm special. Everyone wants to protect me. What's the matter with that? It never would have made sense to the 2 earlier generations the same age. I'll just move through these. Risk averse is another thing. If I'm protected and I'm special, I don't want to take stupid risks with myself. And this actually leads to some of the most positive trends among millennials. One is, and I wish people talked about this more, this epic decline in youth violence. Now, this is the victimization survey. This is the gold standard among people in social science. This scale goes all the way down to 0, right? This is a 75% reduction in serious violent crime from the peak when Gen Xers were in the peak crime, crime age period, which is, late teens and 20s, early 30s. It really doesn't matter which age bracket you use. They all show the same trends. Probably millennials represent the most dramatic decline in youth violence in American history, which is why cities are so safe today, which is why millennials want to live in them. No Xer wanted to live in them. They were dangerous back then. But it's not just crime, it's across the board. In fact, if you're interested in this, the CDC has a youth risk surveillance indicators. You can look at anything. Carried a weapon to school, never wore a seatbelt, drinking while driving, sex in high school. I mean, you can go down a whole range of things. Millennials are taking fewer risks. And now that they're getting older, it goes up to, other things. Stock prices, millennials think they're too risky. Millennials are avoiding credit cards. Entrepreneurship is down among millennials. That was a big badge of pride among Xers, right? Fewer millennials who want to take the risk. All right, positive. Millennials, however much they're set back, are positive. We've seen that, I cover these data all the time. We see that, I think, I always think of SpongeBob, who's probably pathologically positive, right? A pathological optimist, but there he is. No matter what happens, millennials always think in the long run, things will come out all right. The next trait I want to emphasize is team playing, because this is a huge movement directly opposed to where boomers went at the same phase of life. This is a generation who's more likely to volunteer than earlier generations. This is a generation that invented social media, so they could all look at each other and have sort of social oversight, develop a peer consensus about everything. And it's scary for older generations. But, Mark Zuckerberg invented it, actually gave the name social media to it. The whole sharing economy, the whole, the collective workspaces. I mean, all of these things we now associate with the millennial generation have to do with community. And this also translates into policy. So if you ask people of all ages the question, should government promote the principle of community or promote the principle of self-reliance? There's a generational divide of about 30 to 35 points. Doesn't matter if you're asking Democrats, Republicans, independents, and this is why the millennials have turned out to be an overwhelmingly democratically leaning generation, because the Democrats, for better, for worse, claim to be the party of community and the other party does not. And by the way, we are going to see huge turnout increases. I covered the 2018 election in detail. We're going to see an enormous increase when we go into the 2020 election. But let me move on. Millennials are surprisingly conventional. I make this point all the time. A record share of teens today report no problems with any family member, hugely up from where it was with Xers and boomers back in the day. And this is very interesting to me. This generation gets along well with their parents. They call each other every day. They're texting each other all the time. And it's a good thing they get along together because they're living with each other, right? Often because millennials can't afford to live alone. You see this, you can see Pew Research did this. This goes all the way back to 1880s. This is more than a century. And we see some of these astonishing increases. And it's kept going up every year during this 10-year recovery we just had, this economic recovery. And it's going to go up hugely again in 2020 with so many millennials coming back to their extended families, often with a boomer at the top. Home improvement is on a tear right now, not groceries, not clothing, anything else, but people are, redesigning their homes for these new, larger families. And millennials are achievement oriented. I mean, this is, millennials didn't take dumb drugs so much as they took smart drugs. I think they missed a lot of fun there. But then, and you just see their kind of menu-driven optimization attitude toward getting things done. And that's given them sort of a reputation as a left brain generation among a lot of boomers and Xers. Not very good at thinking outside the box, but very good at optimizing inside the box. And then, of course, the stress. When you are a special generation, you're protected, and everyone expects these great things from you. What about the stress of not getting it, right? How are you going to tell people? What about the shame? This is something Gen Xers never felt. No one ever expected anything from them, right? So this is also a different attitude, something changing with this generation. All right. And this is also, right? Millennials don't want to make a mistake, so they want to get the approval from their supervisor. All of these, looked in the long term, are really interesting and profound generational trends. I'm going to look here. I think I have time to continue. So What's next? I'm going to talk a little bit at this point. I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to go from talking about generations to talk about history. And let me actually see. I want to do this so I can actually see my own screen. Okay. So you see this little red thing down here. I said, you know, financial crisis, war on terror, the pandemic crisis, whatever you want to call it. But we see in our schema huge parallels between eras that are 4 apart. Which era was 4 generations before this? It was the Great Depression and World War II. And in fact, I think we are into the next great generation shaping crisis. And that's kind of where I'm shifting gears here. And in fact, I have written a lot about this. I see enormous parallels between the 1930s and the decade we just lived through. Both these decades played out in the shadow of a global financial crash, tepid investment, deflation, fears. Geopolitically, what are we seeing around the world? Just like in the 1930s, isolationism, nationalism, right-wing populism, new authoritarian political models becoming popular, a waning belief in democracy, falling rates of fertility and home ownership, the rise of multi-generational households. We saw that in the 1930s. You remember watching those Frank Capra movies? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, everyone living in those different generations living in those huge Victorian homes. We're doing it again. We're just doing it in these big McMansions, right? Decline in youth violence, blanding of the youth culture. We could go through a lot of parallels there, but I think we are in a similar place in American history. This is Ray Dalio, and many of you know he's a multi-billion-dollar boomer who's head of Bridgewater, but he tracks the same thing. He makes the same parallel. He says, in terms of income inequality, we're reliving the early 1930s, both in wealth and income. And more importantly, and I will say this, he looks at populism, and he says the same trend today. We are having this huge resurgence in populism that we saw in the 1930s around the world. Well, okay, this actually looks like it's part of a longer term trend. About every 80, 90 years, we have an enormous civic makeover, right? The Glorious Revolution, the War of Spanish Succession, the American Revolution, US Civil War, Great Depression. These are all about the length of a long human life apart. And roughly halfway in between, we have the Great Awakenings, the great cultural upheavals, right? So there's a pattern here. There's a pattern of how generations are formed and where they're going. And one thing I would like to do, and this is kind of my wrap up here, but if you look in terms of these generations following each other, GI, silent, boom, X, millennials, so on, you could go back, before the GIs was the lost and the missionary, you see they follow a certain archetypal pattern. This is what I find fascinating. They always come in the same order. Hero generations like the GIs are always born right after awakenings. They always save the country during a crisis. They become politically very powerful generations. They typically occupy, positions of national leadership for a long time. The GI generation certainly did. And they, entering old age, they're greeted by an awakening fired by the young who were born after the crisis. That's happened every time with this generation. It even happened with the Republican generation of Madison, Monroe, and Hamilton, and Jefferson. The prophet archetype is the opposite. The prophets are always born just after the crisis. They come of age with the awakening, and then in their old age, they preside over the next great civic crisis, right? So you see where boomers are. The artists are always the children of the crisis. The nomads are always the children of the awakening. And it really explains how we think about their collective personality. And that leads to different eras. We have a high. That's a period when, right after the crisis, this was when the silent generation is coming of age in the most recent high. But this is a period when institutions are strong, individualism is weak, everyone feels a strong, society feels a great sense of consensus and progress, even though the conformity is suffocating, right? Minorities are kind of kept to the sidelines. It's kind of the good and bad of that kind of era. Now, typically what happens is the next era is an awakening. Everyone tires of that social conformity. Everyone wants to rediscover themselves. Individualism suddenly flourishes. Tremendous protest against the establishment, which the hero generation built. The third turning, I mean, think of this as like, you know, the spring, the summer. The third turning, the unraveling is the fall. Third turning is just the opposite of a high. Institutions are weak and discredited. Individualism is strong and flourishing. And when you're thinking about third turning decades in American history, think of the 1990s, the 1920s, the 1850s, the 1760s. These are all decades of cynicism and bad manners, weak civic authority, often of stock market booms and busts. And history always says that these unraveling eras end in crisis, when new civic institutions have to be reborn and built from the ground up. And if leaders don't, you know, if no emergency shows itself, leaders may even have to fabricate one to mobilize collective action and to bring back some sense of civic belonging and some sense of civic togetherness, which then can lay the foundation for a new high. And we've seen this repeatedly. So then, I think this is my last slide, but I'm just going to say, what are the challenges? What are other challenges in a crisis era? Well, challenges for millennials in their personal lives. I would just say, are you prepared for economic adversity? This, by the way, this just follows different cohort groups. You can see if you were born in each of these groups, this follows your real income thus far in life, right? And you see here from the lost to the GIs to the silent to the boomers, you see these huge rises at the same age. Like every generation was earning more and more money at the same age. But since late wave boomers and Xers, and you see millennials buried here, it's like a giant traffic jam, right? There's no longer any generational progress in prosperity. It's one of the reasons why fertility rate's down. Millennials can't afford to start a household. They can't afford to buy a home. They can't afford to do any of these things, which is considered the prerequisite, kind of the cornerstone of actually starting a family. Well, you may think the country's investing a lot maybe in your future, but they're not. They're borrowing. And take a look at this. This is how much we're going to borrow this year. So just absolutely record share of debt we're putting on to just make people feel comfortable. It's called stimulus. The Fed's adding about $3 trillion to its balance sheet, and Congress is spending about $3 trillion just to take the edge off the pandemic crisis. We'll see if this lasts to the other side. It looks as though we're going to have a new batch of it coming later this month. Well, you know, before Congress goes on its August recess, we'll see. But this is something I think that's on most millennials' mind. My God, who's taking care of the future? The second challenge millennials in their public lives, are you prepared for the rise of authoritarian state power? I say this because every era of crisis always enhances the power of government and the state. It always enhances authority. We see this around the world, by the way. And if you want to take a look, just go to the Freedom in the World Index and you see rising populism and authoritarianism all over the world. You can see down here 14 consecutive years of declining democracy, according to Freedom House. And it's all over the area. It's in Latin America, it's in Mexico, it's in Argentina, it's in Brazil, it's all over South Asia. My God, don't even mention China. Look at Eastern Europe. But this is something that's happening. People are losing, particularly young people, are losing faith in democracies now, in sort of liberal democracy. They're wondering, what are these liberal democracies doing to invest in my future? I'm beginning to be fascinated by certain more authoritarian approaches. And one of them, I think that's on a lot of people's mind, is the use of technology for surveillance, sometimes called total tech. This is one artist's illustration of the power of the social credit system being implemented in mainland China right now. I guess you could say probably soon to be implemented in Hong Kong. Everyone will be rated on their civic behavior, right? Are we ready for this? How much totalitarianism do we want to have? And to fight totalitarianism, to fight authoritarianism, do we need to be a little bit authoritarian ourselves? This is a question that many of the democracies face.
I have to say thank you to Neil. It was really interesting, his lecture, and it gives us a lot to think about. Please join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. when we'll discuss the fashion industry insight from alumni insiders at Marquesa and Uniqlo. Have a great day.